You are, by any honest measure, worth more than every visible marker on this entire street combined. Your neighbors have lived beside you for 6 years, and still have no idea what you are worth. They have watched your car, your lawn, your porch light, and drawn every wrong conclusion possible. This is the story of exactly what they have been measuring, and exactly how wrong it has been. A realtor's flyer landed in your mailbox once, estimating home values for the entire street casually. Your house sat quietly mid-range on paper. Nothing about the flyer hinted at what sat behind the number. The street has 14 houses, and you have lived in the smallest one for 6 years now. Your neighbors on either side both upgraded their cars twice since you first moved in here. You still park the same 12-year-old sedan in the same spot on the same driveway. A neighbor once joked that you must really love that car to keep it running this long. You laughed along, said something about not fixing what was not broken, and left it there. The joke was not wrong exactly, it just was not measuring the thing it thought it was measuring. A landscaper knocked on your door once, unprompted, offering a free consultation for the yard. You declined politely, telling him honestly that the yard suited you exactly the way it was. He seemed surprised. Most houses on the street had used his services at least once by then. You mowed the lawn yourself most weekends, partly for the exercise, partly out of old habit. A neighbor once offered to recommend his lawn service, assuming you simply had not found one yet. Your lawn stayed simple, mowed regularly, nothing fancy, no elaborate landscaping like some houses nearby. 2 houses down, a neighbor spent an entire summer installing an elaborate stone garden feature. You admired it honestly when you walked past, and meant every word of the compliment. He asked, half joking, when you were finally going to invest in your own yard properly. You told him you were saving for something else, which was, in fact, completely accurate. He assumed the something else meant a better car, and you let the assumption stand there. The actual something else had nothing to do with cars, and everything to do with a spreadsheet. A neighbor's teenager once asked bluntly why your car looked so much older than everyone else's. You told him the car still ran fine, and fine had always mattered more to you than new. He shrugged, unconvinced, and wandered back toward the food table without much further thought about it. The street held an annual block party every summer, the same modest gathering year after year. Neighbors compared vacation photos, kitchen renovations, and the occasional new car parked out front. You brought a simple dish, listened more than you talked, and asked good questions when you did. Someone asked what you had been up to that year, and you gave the shortest honest answer available. Work has been steady, you said, which was true in the same way most careful sentences were. Nobody pushed further, the same way nobody ever really did at gatherings like this one. You left early, the same way you always did, before the conversations turned toward specifics. A contractor working on her kitchen once mistook you for hired help while parking on the street. You corrected him gently, and he apologized, slightly embarrassed by the honest mistake he would made. You did not mind the mix-up, it fit the general shape of how the street usually read you anyway. A neighbor across the street gutted her kitchen that spring, contractors coming and going for weeks. She showed you photos proudly one afternoon, genuinely excited about the granite countertops and new cabinets. You told her it looked wonderful, and meant it, without mentioning your own kitchen had not changed once. Your kitchen still had the same cabinets from when you first bought the house 6 years earlier. You had the money to renovate twice over, and simply had never felt the pull to do it. The kitchen worked fine, and fine, you had learned, rarely needed defending to impress anyone else. She never asked why your kitchen stayed the same, and you never offered an explanation either. You sometimes wondered what the street would look like if everyone stopped competing all at once. Probably calmer. You guessed, though also probably temporary, the pull toward comparison rarely stayed away long. You were not trying to fix the street, you were just quietly living outside its usual rules. You noticed the pattern extended beyond objects. Vacations got compared to restaurants, even weekend plans. You kept your own weekends simple and rarely mentioned them. The same quiet policy as everything else. You noticed, over time, how much of the street ran on quiet, constant comparison with each other. New cars appeared within weeks of other new cars, as if triggered by some invisible signal. Landscaping projects seemed to spread from house to house, each one slightly more elaborate than the last. You stayed outside that entire cycle, the same modest lawn, the same aging car, year after year. It would have been easy to join in. You had more than enough room in the budget for it. You simply never wanted to. The comparison game had never once appealed to you personally. Opting out felt like its own quiet kind of freedom that most of the street never noticed. The new couple invited the whole street over for a housewarming a few weeks after moving in. Their home looked polished and current, filled with the kind of details magazines usually photographed. You complimented specific details genuinely, and left before the evening turned into direct comparisons. A young couple moved in next door that year, ambitious, stylish, quick to make an impression. Within a month, they had a new fence, fresh paint, and 2 cars gleaming in the driveway. They introduced themselves warmly, glancing briefly at your car and your unchanged, modest front yard. You could see the quick calculation happen behind their eyes, the same one most people made. They were friendly regardless, genuinely so, and the calculation never turned into anything unkind. You appreciated that about them. Whatever assumptions they carried never once affected how they treated you. Some assumptions, you had learned, cost nothing at all if the person carrying them stays kind anyway. Another neighbor's basement flooded that same storm season, an expensive and stressful repair altogether. You offered to help move furniture during the cleanup, showing up with old clothes and no expectations. Nobody at that cleanup knew what the offer had actually cost you, which was, quite simply, nothing. A different storm the following year damaged 3 roofs simultaneously, straining every household's patience and budget. You quietly covered the deductible gap for the family struggling most, routed through their own insurance paperwork. They never knew the exact mechanism, only that the numbers had somehow worked out better than expected. A storm hit hard that autumn, and the new neighbor's fence came down across both driveways. He apologized repeatedly, clearly worried about the cost of replacing something that was not fully his fault. You told him not to worry about your side, and quietly paid for the full repair yourself. He tried to pay you back twice, and you waved it off both times without much explanation. He assumed you had found a good deal on materials, and you let that assumption stand there too. The actual cost barely registered against the number sitting quietly in an account he would never see. He thanked you again weeks later, still slightly confused about how you had managed it so easily. A different neighbor asked almost the same question months later, curious about your unchanging routine. You gave a similar short answer, the phrasing slightly different, but the core message exactly the same. You noticed you were getting better at answering honestly without actually revealing very much at all. You sometimes rehearsed better answers in your head, imagining conversations where you told the full truth. None of the rehearsed versions ever made it out loud, the habit too deeply set to override easily. The renovation neighbor asked you directly one afternoon why you never seemed to upgrade anything at all. You paused longer than usual, genuinely considering how much of the truth to actually share. You told her, partially, that you preferred putting money toward things nobody could see from the street. She looked puzzled, the kind of confusion that comes from an answer that does not fully compute. You did not elaborate further, and she did not push, the conversation drifting towards something else entirely. Walking home afterward, you wondered briefly if you should have just told her the actual truth. You decided, the same way you always decided, that the shorter answer served you better long term. You ran the full numbers one quiet Sunday, comparing your position against public data for the area. By any reasonable measure, you sat well above every visible marker the street used to judge worth. The data made you smile briefly. Then you closed the laptop and went back to an ordinary afternoon. None of the 14 houses on the street held anywhere close to your actual combined position. You never once felt the need to prove that fact to a single person living among them. A financial planner you consulted once called your situation the most understated portfolio he would ever reviewed. You took it as a compliment, though you suspected he meant it as something closer to genuine confusion. By that point, the modest house next to 14 others held more equity than most of the street combined. Investments sat quietly alongside it, untouched by any of the visible upgrades happening around the neighborhood. Combined, the actual number would have startled every single neighbor who had ever joked about your car. None of them would ever know that, because none of them were ever going to ask directly. The street measured worth in visible upgrades, and you had simply opted out of that entire currency. It was not a trick, exactly. It was just a different definition of what actually counted as wealth. The neighbors were reading the wrong signals, and you had never once felt the need to correct them. You started checking on the widow more often after that conversation, small visits, nothing dramatic. She never asked for help directly, but seemed to welcome the company more than she ever said outright. You never mentioned money to her again, and she never brought up her late husband's secret either. The widow mentioned once that her husband had donated to the school fund anonymously for 30 straight years. Nobody on the street had ever connected those decades of mystery gifts to the quiet man who lived there. You wondered, walking home that day, whether someone would tell a similar story about you one day. The oldest resident on the street, a widow in her 70s, had lived there longer than anyone else. She rarely commented on cars or renovations, and seemed to watch the street with quiet amusement instead. One afternoon she told you plainly that you reminded her of her late husband, careful and quiet. He had been wealthy too, she said, and nobody on the street had ever guessed it while he lived. You asked carefully how she had known about you, and she just smiled without answering directly. Some people notice patterns the rest of the street never thinks to look for, she said simply. You never asked her again, and she never brought it up a second time either. The salesman followed up twice by phone over the next month, persistent in a friendly, practiced way. You declined both times, briefly, without much explanation beyond simply not being interested anymore. The old sedan started without complaint the next morning, the same as it always reliably had. A different showroom sent a mailer months later, offering a special financing deal timed around the holidays. You looked at it for a moment, recycled it, and felt no real pull toward the offer at all. A luxury car dealership opened a new showroom near the neighborhood, visible from the main road. You drove past it often, and one weekend finally stopped in, just to look, you told yourself. A salesman approached quickly, already picturing which model might finally impress the entire street. You pictured pulling into the driveway, watching the whole street reconsider everything at once. The image held for a moment, tempting in a way you had not expected walking into the showroom. Then you thought about 6 years of careful invisibility, and what one loud purchase might unravel. You thanked the salesman, walked back out, and drove the same 12-year-old sedan home again. Word never spread beyond simple curiosity. The gift remained a pleasant mystery for the rest of that winter. You liked it that way, small acts landing exactly where they were needed without any attached name. The neighbor's decorations looked fuller again by the following year, though you never asked why. You had done similar things before, on other streets, in other years, always the same quiet pattern. The habit had started small, years earlier, and simply never stopped feeling like the right way to live. That winter you noticed the Renovation neighbor's holiday decorations looked sparse compared to previous years. A quiet conversation at the mailbox revealed her husband had lost significant hours at work recently. She mentioned it briefly, embarrassed, and quickly changed the subject to something lighter instead. You said nothing that day but left a gift card in their mailbox anonymously 2 weeks later. She mentioned it at the next block gathering, mystified about who could have possibly sent it. You listened along with everyone else, offering no theories, matching the room's genuine curiosity. Being suspected by nobody, it turned out, was almost as satisfying as the gift itself had been. A few weeks later, someone else's car came up in a similar unofficial way during casual mailbox conversation. You noticed you were not the only one on the street, living a little differently than assumptions suggested. The street held a homeowners association meeting twice a year, usually about fences and paint colors. A dispute arose that spring about whether older cars violated some unwritten aesthetic standard nobody enforced consistently. Someone mentioned your car specifically, not unkindly, just as an example during the broader discussion. You said nothing in your own defense, letting the conversation move naturally toward other topics instead. The proposal failed by a wide margin, most neighbors uninterested in policing something so minor. You thanked the room quietly afterward, genuinely relieved without making any visible show of it. Walking home, you reflected on how close the street had come to voting on something they misunderstood completely. It would have been easy to end the debate early by simply explaining the truth about the car. You chose silence instead, the same choice you had made in nearly every similar moment before. You thought about the widow's late husband again, wondering how many quiet gifts he had sent over decades. Streets like this one, you suspected, probably held more of these stories than anyone would ever guess. A neighbor's son got accepted to an expensive university that spring, and the family worried openly about cost. You overheard pieces of the conversation at the mailbox, careful not to intrude on something private. Weeks later, an anonymous contribution appeared through the university's financial aid office for that exact family. The family never learned the source, attributing it instead to some unnamed scholarship program they would applied for. You saw the son loading a car for his first semester later that summer, proud and completely unaware. You waved normally, wished him well, and felt no pull whatsoever to explain anything further. Being unseen in that specific moment felt like exactly the right shape for the gesture to take. Months later, he mentioned in passing that the new job had turned out to be the best move of his career. You told him that was great to hear, and genuinely meant every word of the simple response. A neighbor 2 doors down lost his job unexpectedly that autumn, a sudden and visible shift in routine. His car stayed in the driveway on weekday mornings instead of leaving at its usual reliable time. You noticed, the way you noticed most small changes on a street you had watched for 6 years. You did not offer money directly, sensing it might embarrass him more than it would actually help. Instead, you mentioned an opening at a company you had a loose professional connection to nearby. He followed up on the lead, and landed an interview within the same week he would heard about it. He got the job, and thanked you warmly, never once suspecting how deliberately timed the mention had been. You told him you were just glad it worked out, and left the rest of the story untold. A few neighbors grumbled about the new valuations for weeks, comparing numbers like trading cards at the mailbox. You stayed out of those conversations entirely, the same way you stayed out of most conversations like it. A citywide property reassessment arrived by mail that year, updating official values across the whole street. Your neighbors compared new numbers openly at the mailboxes, some pleased, others visibly frustrated by the increase. You opened yours privately at home, glanced at the modest figure, and filed it away without comment. The official number, like most numbers the street relied on, measured only what could be seen from outside. It had no way of counting what sat quietly behind the front door in an account nobody audited. You almost mentioned this once at a mailbox conversation, then decided against it at the last second. Some numbers, you had learned, were better left exactly where they already were, unspoken and unmeasured. A high school friend visited that summer, someone who had known you long before the street or the habit. She noticed the modest car and house immediately, having expected something different after years apart. You gave her the tour, unbothered by her visible surprise at how ordinary everything actually looked. Over dinner, she asked directly if things had been harder than your old messages ever let on. You laughed, and told her the truth, plainly, the same way you had once told your closest friend before. Her expression shifted slowly from concern to disbelief to something closer to quiet, delighted amusement. She asked why you lived exactly the way you did, and you gave her the same honest answer as always. She left the next morning promising to visit more often, still shaking her head slightly at the whole story. A neighbor mentioned afterward that the shelter had made the entire street feel a little safer overall. You had not built it for that reason originally, but you did not mind the unexpected extra purpose either. A severe weather warning hit the area that spring, sending most of the street into a brief scramble. Your basement, unlike most on the street, had been quietly reinforced years earlier as a proper shelter. You opened your door to 3 neighboring families who had nowhere sturdier to wait out the warning. They packed into the basement together, children included, grateful and slightly amazed at how solid it felt. Someone asked, mid-storm, why your basement felt so much more solid than anyone else's on the street. You said you had had it reinforced a while back, leaving out exactly how much that reinforcement had cost. The storm passed within the hour, and everyone filed back out, thanking you warmly on their way home. That evening, the street felt a little closer than usual, and you found you did not mind that at all. A teacher later mentioned the mystery donor story to her class, turning it into a small lesson about kindness. You heard about the lesson secondhand, from a neighbor, and felt a quiet warmth you did not examine too closely. The local elementary school held its annual fundraiser that spring, needing new equipment for the playground. Neighbors donated modestly, competing quietly for visible recognition on a large thank you board near the entrance. You donated the full remaining balance needed for the new equipment, anonymously, through the school's office directly. The board never listed your name, since the office had honored your request to keep the gift anonymous. Neighbors speculated for weeks about which local business or wealthy family must have covered the rest. You let the speculation continue, offering no hints, comfortable letting the mystery simply remain unsolved. The new playground equipment opened that summer, children playing on it without any idea who had made it possible. Watching them from a distance felt like the entire point of the gesture, quiet and complete on its own. You thought about all of it that evening: the fence, the gift card, the school, the storm shelter. None of it had ever needed the street to know, and somehow that had always been the entire point. The street would wake up tomorrow the same way it always did: cars in driveways, lawns freshly mowed. Nobody would look twice at the smallest house on the block, and that had always been exactly the plan. 6 years in, the street still read you the same way it always had: quiet, modest, unremarkable. The car stayed the same, the kitchen stayed the same, the lawn stayed exactly as simple as ever. Underneath all of it, the actual number had grown into something the street would never guess. You did not feel superior to any of your neighbors. Most of them were kind, genuine people. You simply measured worth differently than they did, and had stopped needing them to measure it the same way. Tomorrow, the street would look exactly the same: cars in driveways, lawns freshly mowed, nothing unusual. And somewhere behind one unremarkable porch light, the quietest house on the block kept holding its secret.